Strategic Air Command, created by the US Air Force at the very birth of the Cold War era, had in 1946 a tremendous responsibility. It was tasked with organizing, planning, and if the worst was to happen, executing the delivery of nuclear weapons to their targets. Now, keep in mind that in 1946, and for almost a decade after, the only way to deliver a strategic nuclear weapon was by airplane, and not just any airplane. The size and weight of early nuclear devices required strategic bomber aircraft capable of carrying their destructive payloads for thousands of kilometers and, in practice, still be able to return to their bases. This meant that the closer a base could be built to the enemy, the more potential targets could be struck. But this isn't new information to the vast majority of you. So why am I telling you? Because today we're going to talk about the northernmost American Armed Forces base to be put into use. A base that was never actually a secret, whose construction was a marvel of engineering, and one which attempted to turn the tide of the Cold War in favor of the Americans. I'm your host David, and today we are going to Greenland and Thule. This is the really Cold War. Okay, so Thule. I can hear some of you asking already, what's a Thule? Well, Thule isn't a thing, but rather a place. It's over 1,200 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle and just over 1,500 kilometers south of the North Pole in the northwest corner of Greenland. It's a rather inhospitable location for much of the year, with average temperatures in high summer not getting much above 7 degrees centigrade and averaging below minus 20 degrees in winter. And while it's sunny all summer, this is offset by seemingly perpetual darkness in the winter months. But Thule, sitting so close to the high Arctic and on a deepwater port, made it strategically valuable as the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union grew as frosty as the ice in North Star Bay. Thule's geographic position made it ideal in the early Cold War era as the strategic bombers available to Strategic Air Command, SAC, by the early 1950s. The B-36 Peacemaker and the B-47 Stratojet would both be able to reach the majority of nuclear targets in the Soviet Union and only require one airborne refueling in the process. Their proximity also minimized Soviet early detection and response times. Thule's position also gave a forward base for interceptor aircraft to attack Soviet aircraft intent on attacking North America over the pole. Of course, in the early 1950s, the only thing present at Thule was a Second World War era weather station supported by a gravel airstrip. As I'm sure you can all guess, a gravel airstrip can't support wings of jet interceptors, let alone strategic bomber aircraft. Well, maybe Soviet-made interceptors, which were built to a more rugged standard, but that's a tangent for a different day. Now, as the most astute of you will already know, Greenland at this time was a part of Denmark, and although the US had an agreement with the Danes in place since the Second World War, the so-called Kaufman Agreement, that allowed for the US to operate military bases in Greenland for as long as a threat to North America existed. The Kaufman Agreement remained in place even after 1945, but by the time the US Armed Forces was eyeing Thule, the Kaufman Agreement had been formally ratified by the Danish government, giving the US Armed Forces a free hand to do what they wanted. I should point out here as well that the ratification was requested by NATO to become part of the Defensive Alliances program. This request was accepted, creating the Greenland Defense Area, inside which facilities were available to any NATO member. Now, to backtrack a tiny bit. The year before the ratification of the Kaufman Agreement, in 1950, a recommendation by a board of US Air Force officers to pursue a base at Thule was made, which was subsequently endorsed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as President Truman. When the Kaufman Agreement was ratified, Operation Blue Jay was initiated. And just what was Operation Blue Jay? Well, it was the plan to actually build the airbase. Of course, the United States Army Corps of Engineers had lots of experience in building air bases. After all, they'd built them all over the world during the Second World War. But Thule was different. To begin with, it wasn't located on or even near global sea lanes, making transport of building material extremely difficult. A single gravel airstrip meant air travel into the site was limited. The terrain itself was an engineering challenge as it sat on permafrost, that's ground that never thawed even in summer. And finally, the building season was severely limited by the Arctic winter and darkness. If an airbase was to be constructed, it had to be completed by November. On June 6, 1951, 120 ships left Norfolk, Virginia, bound for North Star Bay. These ships carried not only 300,000 pounds of cargo for the construction of the base, but also the 12,000 men who were tasked to build it. All the men hired were required to have extensive experience in the construction industry, and in fact, many of them had served in the Second World War as part of engineering units. The voyage to Thule, one which would take approximately 2 weeks under normal conditions, took over a month as a result of delays due to sea ice. Upon arrival on July 9, the fleet began disgorging its enormous cargo, and construction was begun immediately. All told, in 104 days, the base was completed, including the construction of 82 miles of roads, 38 fuel tanks, 10 hangars, 6 of which were 28,000 square feet each, by the way, 122 barracks, 6 mess halls, a gym, a service club, an officers club, a hobby club, a library, a base exchange, a post office, a theater, a chapel, a hospital, 63 warehouses, a laundry, a bakery, 2 main power plants, and 4 backup power and heating plants, all in 104 days. On August 18th, the airstrip was inaugurated and brought into service, and by October 23rd, the last of the construction crews had left Thule to go home. Of the 12,000 crew that arrived 3 months earlier, only 400 remained as a caretaker force through the winter. For anybody out there who's interested in a more detailed video on this enormous construction project, archive.org has a 1952 big picture film available detailing the entire project. Not only is the film extremely interesting from an engineering and logistics perspective, the narrative given is a fantastic example of American Cold War propaganda. We'll include the link in the show notes for those of you who want to check it out. Air operations began as early as September of 1951, but the base didn't come under Air Force jurisdiction until November of 1952, when a squadron of interceptors was stationed there. So SAC, remember them? The reason the base was being built? Well, they began operating B-36s and B-47s, supported by KC-97 air-to-air tankers, in 1953, and Thule became the forward line of US air defense and offense in the Cold War. In only 3 years, the United States had moved its strike force 1,000 miles closer to Soviet targets. Thule remained a highly active SAC base until approximately 1965, when US operations there began to scale back. This was in light of some technological changes going on in the US military regarding the nuclear deterrence force. The advent of ICBM technology, both land and sea-based, meant that a bomber force was no longer considered the best delivery system for strategic nuclear weapons. Thule, however, remained relevant as it was not only the site of several ELINT projects and early warning systems, including BMUs, but also to several secret-ish projects, the most notable being Camp Century. Camp Century was a research station built approximately 150 miles from Thule on the ice sheet itself. A cold weather research camp, it was not only powered by its own portable nuclear reactor, but acted as a cover for something called Project Iceworm. Project Iceworm was a plan to build medium-range ballistic missile silos into the ice sheet and thus increase the nuclear first strike capability of the US Armed Forces against the Soviet Union. The idea was that because these silos were significantly closer to Soviet targets, the USSR would have far less time to react, thereby increasing the win capability of the United States in the event of a nuclear war. Fortunately for all of us, it was discovered that an ice sheet was a terrible place to construct buried missile silos. Because the ice sheet was always in motion, the silos would quickly deform and at best render them useless for launch, or at worst would collapse the silos and destroy the contents. By 1966, Camp Century and Project Iceworm had been abandoned. Shamefully, much of the waste from the camp was simply left behind, assuming it would be trapped forever in the ice. This included not only human waste, but diesel fuels and possibly even nuclear waste from the portable reactor, whose core may have been left behind. With changing global temperatures, it's now believed that much of this waste could come free and make its way to populated areas of Greenland and the Arctic Ocean. Now, in addition to Camp Century, other research camps were also established. Camp Tuto, for example. Tuto, short for Thule Takeoff, was established in 1952 and located on the edge of the glacial ice sheet, acting as a research base and a primary resupply point for inland bases such as Century. Tuto hosted the Polar Research and Development Center and the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory, as well as the first Engineering Arctic Task Force. All of these conducted research and gathered scientific information on cold weather matters, and research done there was vital in furthering cold weather engineering science and the construction of ice runways. Thule continues to operate as a US military base to this day. Since 1982, it's been the home of Air Force Space Command Center, now part of the US Space Force. Thule is home to about 600 personnel, down from its peak of over 10,000 in the heydays of Strategic Air Command. The airbase was a powerful symbol for many of the ability of the United States to project its power on a global scale and to show itself willing to go toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union. In the early 1950s, this was a dangerous game of chicken where failure meant annihilation, not only of the participants, but of the spectators as well. However, Thule also served as an opportunity for scientific research and advancement. If there was ever a symbolic legacy of the Cold War, representing an advancement in the face of imminent destruction, Thule is that symbol. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, consider supporting us via patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.